December 15, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Private First Class Thomas Williams crouched in a frozen foxhole, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter cold air as German artillery thundered across the snow-covered landscape. Around him, the scattered remnants of the 106th Infantry Division huddled against what would later be known as the opening assault of Germany's final major offensive on the Western Front. Williams believed, like every other American soldier in that forest, that they were facing just another routine patrol skirmish, something they could handle with standard tactics and superior firepower. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew was that in the next 72 hours, the power of a single human voice would accomplish what months of combat had failed to achieve, creating a moment of shared humanity that would echo through the memories of soldiers on both sides for the rest of their lives. Williams had grown up in the small town of Meridian, Mississippi, where his grandfather had been a preacher at the local Baptist church. Every Sunday morning, young Thomas would sit in the front pew, listening to his grandfather's deep, resonant voice lead the congregation in hymns that seemed to shake the very foundations of the wooden building. His grandfather, Reverend Samuel Williams, had been born into slavery in 1858, gaining his freedom during the Civil War and dedicating his life to serving his community through faith and music. The old man had taught Thomas that music was a universal language, capable of reaching into the darkest corners of human experience and bringing light where there seemed to be only shadow and despair. Thomas had enlisted in the army in 1943, joining the ranks of the approximately 1 million African-American men who served during the conflict. Despite facing segregation and discrimination within the military itself, these soldiers fought with distinction across every theater of operations. The experience of serving in a segregated military had been particularly challenging for Williams, who found himself fighting for the freedom of nations abroad, while his own people struggled for basic civil rights at home. Nevertheless, his grandfather's teachings about dignity, faith, and the power of music had sustained him through the difficult months of training and deployment. Williams had been assigned to a supply unit attached to the 106th Infantry Division, a newly arrived formation that had only reached the European theater in early December. The division consisted of approximately 14,500 men, mostly fresh recruits with limited combat experience, positioned in what military planners considered a quiet sector of the front. These young soldiers, many of them still teenagers from farms and small towns across America, had received only basic training before being shipped overseas to face an enemy that had been hardened by years of warfare across multiple continents. The division's commanding officers had repeatedly assured their men that this assignment represented a relatively safe introduction to European combat operations. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces in the Ardennes sector were composed primarily of second-line troops, older men and young recruits who lacked the experience and equipment of front-line formations. This assessment would prove catastrophically incorrect, as German planners had deliberately created the impression of weakness, while secretly concentrating their most experienced and well-equipped divisions for a massive surprise offensive. The German offensive that began on December 16th involved approximately 200,000 troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, launching a coordinated attack across an 85-mile front. The operation, codenamed Watch on the Rhine by German planners, aimed to split Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. What made this assault particularly devastating was its complete surprise. Allied intelligence had failed to detect the massive buildup of forces in the region, despite numerous indicators that should have warned of impending attack. German deception operations had been remarkably successful in concealing the true scope of their preparations. Radio silence, nighttime movement of troops and equipment, and careful camouflage had hidden the concentration of veteran divisions transferred from the Eastern Front. These formations brought with them hard-won experience from years of combat against Soviet forces, along with equipment that represented the latest developments in German military technology. As dawn broke on December 16th, Williams found himself separated from his unit during the chaos of the initial bombardment. The German artillery barrage had lasted for 90 minutes, firing an estimated 10,000 rounds that shattered trees, destroyed equipment, and scattered American formations across the frozen landscape. The sound was unlike anything Williams had experienced during training, a continuous, earth-shaking roar that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously, making communication impossible and coherent thought nearly so. In the aftermath, Williams had taken shelter in an abandoned farmhouse approximately 3 miles behind what had been the American front lines just hours earlier. The farmhouse belonged to a Belgian family named Dubois, who had fled westward when the first shells began falling. Inside, Williams discovered evidence of their hasty departure: half-eaten breakfast still on the table, children's toys scattered across the floor, family photographs staring down from the mantelpiece. The contrast between this peaceful domestic scene and the violence raging outside created a surreal atmosphere that would remain etched in Williams' memory forever. The Dubois family had clearly lived a modest but comfortable life before the renewed outbreak of warfare disrupted their community. Evidence throughout the house suggested a family deeply rooted in local traditions: handcrafted furniture that had probably been passed down through generations, religious artifacts that spoke to devout Catholic faith, and children's drawings that depicted the peaceful rural life that had existed before armies once again marched through their countryside. Williams could see from family portraits that the household included an elderly couple, their adult son and daughter-in-law, and 2 young children, a boy of perhaps 8 years and a girl who appeared to be around 5. The thought of this innocent family forced to abandon their home in the middle of winter created a profound emotional impact on the young American soldier, reminding him of his own family back in Mississippi and the terrible human cost of the conflict that had consumed much of the world for over 5 years. Through the farmhouse windows, Williams could observe German infantry advancing through the snow-covered fields. These were not the exhausted, demoralized soldiers that Allied propaganda often described. Instead, he saw disciplined troops moving with practiced efficiency, their winter camouflage uniforms and experienced movements indicating that these were veteran formations, possibly from the Eastern Front, where the German military had been engaged in brutal fighting since 1941. The lead elements belonged to the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, a unit that had been rebuilt after suffering heavy losses in Russia but retained a core of experienced officers and non-commissioned personnel. The division had been reorganized in France during the late summer and early autumn of 1944, incorporating both veterans from previous campaigns and new recruits who had received intensive training, designed to prepare them for the challenges of combat against experienced Allied forces. Among the advancing Germans was Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, a 24-year-old machine gunner from Bavaria who had survived 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front. Müller carried the scars of that brutal experience, both physical wounds from shrapnel and the psychological weight of witnessing humanity at its worst. He had joined the German military in 1941 with romantic notions of honor and glory, influenced by propaganda that portrayed military service as the highest expression of patriotic duty and national pride. Müller had volunteered for military service immediately after completing his education at a technical school in Munich, where he had been training to become a mechanical engineer. His family owned a small manufacturing business that produced agricultural equipment for local farmers, and Klaus had planned to modernize their operations using the engineering principles he had learned. The outbreak of war with the Soviet Union had interrupted these peaceful ambitions, drawing Müller into a conflict that would consume the next several years of his life. By December 1944, Müller had long since abandoned any illusions about the nature of conflict, fighting now primarily for the survival of his squad and the hope of somehow returning home to his family's farm. The propaganda that had initially motivated his service had been replaced by a grim determination to protect his comrades and fulfill his responsibilities as a soldier, even as he privately questioned the strategic wisdom of continuing a war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. The Eastern Front had taught Müller lessons about warfare that no training program could have provided. He had witnessed the industrial scale of modern combat, where individual courage and skill mattered less than the ability to coordinate complex operations involving thousands of troops, hundreds of vehicles, and massive quantities of ammunition and supplies. He had seen entire divisions consumed in single engagements, experienced the psychological trauma of sustained combat operations, and learned to compartmentalize his emotions in order to function effectively under extreme stress. Mueller's machine gun team consisted of 3 men operating an MG-42, a weapon capable of firing between 800 and 1,500 rounds per minute. Their ammunition load included 2,400 rounds of 7.92mm ammunition, distributed across multiple belt containers. The technical specifications of their equipment represented the pinnacle of German small arms development, designed for sustained fire support in defensive positions where a small number of trained soldiers could control large areas of terrain through coordinated fields of fire. The MG-42 had earned a fearsome reputation among Allied forces for its distinctive sound and devastating effectiveness. The weapon's high rate of fire created a unique audio signature that experienced soldiers could identify immediately, and its technical capabilities allowed skilled operators to engage multiple targets across extended ranges with remarkable accuracy. For Muller and his team, the machine gun represented both their primary means of contributing to their unit's tactical effectiveness and their best hope for surviving the challenges they would face during the upcoming operation. As the German advance continued, Williams realized that his position in the farmhouse would soon be overrun. The sound of approaching vehicles, the distinctive rumble of tracked armored personnel carriers, indicated that this was no small patrol, but a major formation advancing with significant mechanized support. German doctrine called for combined arms operations, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm enemy positions through concentrated force applied at decisive points. Williams understood that attempting to retreat across open ground would expose him to immediate detection and capture. The snow-covered fields provided no concealment, and the daylight conditions would make any movement visible to German observers who were undoubtedly scanning the area for signs of American forces. Instead, he decided to remain hidden in the farmhouse cellar, hoping that German forces would pass by without conducting a detailed search of buildings they considered already secured. The cellar was accessible through a concealed entrance behind the kitchen pantry, a hiding place that the Belgian family had likely prepared for emergencies during the previous 4 years of occupation. The space was larger than Williams had initially expected, containing stored food supplies, household items, and family heirlooms that the Dubois family had hoped to protect from the dangers of wartime. The hiding place spoke to the harsh realities of life under occupation, where civilian families had been forced to develop strategies for surviving in a landscape dominated by military forces. From his hiding spot, Williams could hear German voices as soldiers entered the farmhouse above. The sounds indicated a systematic search: boots on wooden floors, furniture being moved, doors opening and closing. One voice belonged to Muller, who was directing his machine gun team to establish a firing position covering the western approach to the village. German tactical doctrine emphasized the importance of overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones that would channel any counterattack into predetermined engagement areas where concentrated firepower could be brought to bear. The methodical nature of the German search suggested that these were experienced soldiers who understood the importance of securing their positions before advancing further into enemy territory. Williams could hear equipment being positioned, ammunition being distributed, and communications equipment being tested, all indicators that the German forces intended to establish a temporary headquarters in the farmhouse while their advance elements continued westward toward American defensive positions. For 6 hours, Williams remained motionless in the cellar, while German soldiers established their defensive positions throughout the farmhouse. The temperature in the unheated basement hovered near freezing, and Williams fought against both the physical discomfort and the psychological strain of prolonged hiding. Above him, he could hear the routine activities of soldiers preparing for extended operations, weapons being cleaned and maintained, ammunition being redistributed, communications equipment being tested, and the occasional conversation in German that he could not understand, but whose tone suggested the mix of professionalism and tension that characterized military units operating in combat conditions. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult challenge Williams had faced during his military service. Unlike the active terror of combat, where adrenaline and training provided focus and direction, the prolonged concealment required a different kind of courage. The ability to remain calm and silent while uncertainty and fear gnawed at his resolve. Every sound from above could signal discovery and capture, yet he had no way to influence events or prepare for whatever might occur. As evening approached, Williams heard something that stopped him cold, the sound of German soldiers singing. The melody was unfamiliar, but the harmonized voices created a moment of unexpected beauty amid the harsh environment of warfare. The song was Stille Nacht, Silent Night, a Christmas carol that had originated in Austria over a century earlier and had spread throughout German-speaking regions. For these soldiers, far from home during the Christmas season, the familiar melody provided a connection to family, tradition, and peaceful memories that seemed impossibly distant from their current circumstances. The irony of this moment was not lost on Williams. Here were enemy soldiers, representatives of a regime that his country was fighting to defeat, expressing the same human longing for peace and home that filled his own heart. The song triggered memories of Christmas Eve services at his grandfather's church, where the congregation would gather by candlelight to sing the same hymn, though in English rather than German. Music, Williams realized, transcended the artificial boundaries that war had created between human beings, speaking to universal experiences of loss, hope, and the desire for connection. The German soldiers' voices carried a particular poignancy that spoke to their own experiences of separation from loved ones during the holiday season. Many of these men had not seen their families for months or even years, sustained only by occasional letters that might take weeks to reach them, and by memories of peacetime celebrations that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Their singing represented both an expression of homesickness and an attempt to create moments of beauty and meaning in circumstances that often seemed to rob life of both qualities. When the German singing concluded, Williams found himself overwhelmed by a complex mixture of emotions: homesickness, fear, loneliness, and a strange sense of connection to these enemy soldiers combined to create an almost unbearable psychological tension. Without conscious decision, he began to hum quietly, so quietly that he initially believed the sound would not carry beyond the cellar walls. The melody that emerged from his lips seemed to arise from somewhere deep in his memory, connected to the most fundamental sources of comfort and strength in his life. The tune that emerged from Williams' lips was Amazing Grace, the hymn that his grandfather had taught him as a child, and that had become his source of strength during the most difficult moments of military service. The melody had been written in 1779 by John Newton, a former slave trader who had experienced a religious conversion and dedicated his life to fighting the institution he had once served. For Williams, the hymn represented both personal faith and the broader struggle for human dignity and freedom that gave meaning to his service despite the discrimination he faced within the military itself. The words of Amazing Grace carried particular significance for African American communities, who had adopted the hymn as an expression of their own struggles and hopes for liberation. Williams's grandfather had often explained that the hymn spoke to the universal human experience of redemption, the possibility that individuals could transcend their past mistakes and limitations to become better versions of themselves. This message had sustained the African American community through generations of hardship, providing both comfort during difficult times and inspiration for continued resistance against injustice. What Williams had not anticipated was that the cellar's acoustics, combined with the farmhouse's wooden construction, would amplify his quiet humming into an audible sound that reached the German soldiers above. The first to notice was Muller, whose enhanced hearing, developed through years of listening for enemy movement in combat zones, detected the subtle melody drifting up through the floorboards. His initial reaction was alarm, as an unknown sound in their secured position suggested the presence of an enemy combatant requiring immediate investigation. However, as Muller listened more carefully, he realized that the sound was not tactical communication or preparation for attack, but rather musical expression, a human voice raised in what was clearly a spiritual song. The melody of Amazing Grace, while unfamiliar to Muller in terms of specific lyrics, followed musical patterns that were recognizable across cultural boundaries, The hymn's structure, its rising and falling phrases, its emotional crescendo, its sense of longing and resolution, communicated meaning that transcended language barriers. Muller found himself inexplicably moved by the unknown singer's expression of what seemed to be both sorrow and hope. The melody carried emotional weight that spoke to universal human experiences, the pain of separation from loved ones, the uncertainty of an unknown future, the search for meaning in circumstances that often seemed meaningless. These were feelings that Muller recognized from his own wartime service, emotions that he had learned to suppress in order to function effectively as a soldier, but that still existed beneath the surface of his professional composure. Rather than immediately alerting his squad to investigate the source of the singing, Müller made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He raised his hand, signaling his men to remain silent and listen. The other German soldiers, trained to respond instantly to their leader's commands, froze in position while the mysterious hymn continued to drift through the winter air. This moment of hesitation represented a choice between military protocol and human curiosity, between the demands of warfare and the recognition of shared humanity. Williams, unaware that he had acquired an audience, continued singing as the emotion of his situation overwhelmed his caution. His voice grew stronger, the words of his grandfather's favorite hymn filling the cramped cellar space. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Each verse carried the weight of personal experience, the journey from confusion to understanding, from despair to hope, from isolation to connection with something larger than oneself. The hymn's lyrics spoke to themes that were particularly relevant to Williams's current situation. The idea of being lost and then found resonated with his physical circumstances as a soldier separated from his unit, while the spiritual message of redemption and grace provided comfort during a time of extreme uncertainty and danger. Singing these familiar words in this unfamiliar and threatening environment created a sense of continuity with his past and hope for his future that helped sustain his emotional equilibrium. Above ground, Muller's squad listened in complete silence as the African-American soldier's voice rose and fell with the ancient melody. None of them understood the English lyrics, but the emotional content was unmistakable. This was the voice of someone far from home, facing uncertainty and danger, finding strength in faith and tradition. It was an experience that every soldier in that farmhouse could understand, regardless of nationality or language, because it spoke to the fundamental human condition during wartime. The effect on the German soldiers was profound and immediate. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, found himself thinking of his own family's Christmas traditions in the Rhineland. His wife Maria would be preparing for Christmas Eve services at their village church, probably wondering whether her husband was still alive somewhere on the distant battlefield. Weber had not heard sacred music since leaving Germany 18 months earlier, and the unexpected encounter with this enemy soldier's hymn triggered a flood of memories and emotions that he had worked hard to suppress. Weber remembered the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings in his hometown, the smell of his wife's cooking filling their small apartment, the laughter of his young daughter playing in their garden during the peaceful summers before the war consumed everything. These memories had become both a source of strength and a source of pain. Strength because they reminded him of what he was fighting to protect, pain because they emphasized how much he had lost and how uncertain his future had become. Gefreiter Johann Stein, the youngest member of the machine gun squad at 19 years old, was reminded of his mother's bedtime songs from childhood. Stein had been drafted directly from his apprenticeship as a carpenter, thrust into military service before he had fully processed the transition from civilian to soldier. The singing voice from below seemed to speak directly to his own fears and uncertainties, creating an unexpected moment of human connection across enemy lines that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of warfare. Stein's experience of military service had been particularly jarring because of his age and limited life experience outside his family's workshop. He had grown up in a small Bavarian village where everyone knew everyone else, where conflicts were resolved through conversation and community pressure. where violence was rare and always shocking when it occurred. The industrial scale of modern warfare, with its emphasis on destroying enemy forces through superior firepower and tactical coordination, seemed to belong to a different universe from the one in which he had been raised. For nearly 20 minutes, Williams continued singing hymns from his grandfather's repertoire. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Were You There When They Crucified My Lord, Go Down Moses. Each song carried the historical weight of African American experience, the struggle for freedom and dignity in the face of oppression. These spirituals had sustained enslaved communities through generations of hardship, providing both comfort and coded messages of resistance and hope that helped preserve cultural identity and collective memory. The spirituals represented a unique fusion of African musical traditions with Christian religious themes, creating a distinctive art form that spoke to the specific experiences of African Americans while addressing universal themes of suffering, faith, and redemption. Williams's grandfather had taught him that these songs were not just entertainment or even worship, but historical documents that preserved the stories of his ancestors and their struggles for freedom and dignity. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot had particular significance because of its dual meaning, as both a religious song about passing and salvation and a coded message about the Underground Railroad that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The chariot in the song referred both to the biblical story of Elijah being taken up to heaven and to the network of safe houses and guides that provided practical assistance to those seeking liberation. This combination of spiritual and practical meaning reflected the way that music had served multiple functions within African American communities. Go Down Moses told the biblical story of the Israelites' liberation from slavery in Egypt, but its lyrics also spoke directly to the contemporary struggle of African Americans for freedom from bondage. The song's refrain, Let My People Go, had become a rallying cry for abolitionists and enslaved people alike, expressing both religious faith and political resistance in language that could be sung openly, even in the presence of those who opposed emancipation. The German soldiers above gradually recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Here was an enemy combatant, trapped and alone, choosing to express his humanity through music rather than preparing for combat or escape. The singing demonstrated a courage that was different from battlefield bravery. The courage to remain human in the midst of dehumanizing circumstances, to assert the value of beauty and faith even when surrounded by violence and hatred. Muller faced a decision that would define his character for the remainder of his life. Military protocol dictated immediate capture or elimination of enemy personnel within German positions. However, the machine gunner found himself confronting a moral complexity that his training had never addressed. How does one respond with violence to such a profound expression of shared humanity? How does one treat as an enemy someone who has just revealed himself to be fundamentally similar to oneself in his deepest fears and hopes? The question went to the heart of what warfare had become in the 20th century. Traditional military training emphasized the importance of dehumanizing enemy forces, making it psychologically possible for ordinary people to engage in organized violence against other human beings. This dehumanization was accomplished through propaganda that portrayed enemies as fundamentally different and inherently evil, through training that emphasized tactical considerations rather than individual humanity, and through military culture that rewarded professional competence while discouraging emotional engagement with enemy personnel. However, moments like this one revealed the artificial nature of wartime dehumanization. The American soldier's singing had stripped away the propaganda and revealed him to be a young man far from home, sustained by the same sources of comfort and meaning that sustained German soldiers in similar circumstances. This recognition created a moral crisis for Muller, forcing him to choose between his military responsibilities and his human instincts. As Williams concluded his impromptu concert with Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, the farmhouse fell into complete silence. German and American soldier alike seemed to recognize that something significant had occurred, a moment of connection that transcended the artificial boundaries of warfare. The silence stretched for several minutes, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding and the recognition that the simple act of singing had transformed the relationship between these enemies in ways that neither side could fully comprehend. Finally, Muller made his choice. Instead of descending to capture the hidden American, he began to sing. His voice, trained in Bavarian folk traditions, carried the melody of O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree, a song that celebrated the enduring beauty of nature through seasonal changes. The metaphor seemed particularly appropriate for the moment, the idea that some things remain constant and beautiful despite the chaos surrounding them, that hope and life persist even in the darkest circumstances. Müller's decision to respond with music, rather than violence, represented a profound rejection of the dehumanizing logic of warfare. By choosing to answer song with song, rather than responding to the discovery of an enemy with military action, he was asserting the primacy of human connection over institutional obligation. This choice carried significant personal risk, potentially exposing him to charges of failing in his military duties, but Müller's recognition of shared humanity proved more powerful than his fear of consequences. One by one, Müller's squad joined in the singing. Their harmonized voices filled the farmhouse with a traditional German Christmas carol, creating an acoustic response to the American soldiers' spiritual offerings. The exchange was not planned or coordinated. It emerged spontaneously from the recognition of shared humanity between enemies. Weber added his bass voice to the harmony, while Stein contributed a clear tenor that reminded his comrades of church choirs from their hometowns. The sound of multiple German voices singing together created a moment of profound beauty that seemed to suspend the normal rules of warfare. These soldiers, trained to view their mission in terms of tactical objectives and military necessity, found themselves participating in an act of artistic collaboration with an enemy combatant. The music created a temporary sanctuary, where the artificial divisions of nationalism and ideology seemed less important than the universal human need for connection and meaning. Williams, listening from the cellar, experienced a revelation that challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of conflict. These German soldiers, whom he had been trained to view as inhuman enemies, were revealing themselves to be homesick, frightened young men who found comfort in the same sources that sustained him: music, faith, memories of home and family. The singing continued for another hour, with German carols alternating with African-American spirituals in an impromptu concert that transformed the farmhouse into a temporary sanctuary. The musical exchange created a space outside normal military categories where human beings could encounter each other as individuals rather than as representatives of opposing forces. In this space, the usual logic of warfare, which demanded that enemies be destroyed rather than understood, gave way to a different kind of logic, based on recognition of shared experience and mutual vulnerability. The soldiers on both sides found themselves participating in something that their training had never prepared them for, a moment of genuine communication across enemy lines. When the musical exchange finally concluded, both sides returned to the reality of their situation. Müller and his squad had to continue their military mission, advancing through the Belgian countryside as part of the German offensive. Williams had to survive as a cut-off American soldier behind enemy lines. However, the experience had changed all of them in ways that would become apparent only years later, as they struggled to integrate this moment of humanity into their understanding of war and their memories of military service. Müller made a decision that saved Williams' life. Instead of investigating the cellar, he led his squad out of the farmhouse without revealing the American soldiers' presence. As the German machine gun team departed, Müller left behind a small portion of their field rations, black bread, sausage, and ersatz coffee, placed conspicuously on the kitchen table, where Williams would easily discover them when it was safe to emerge from his hiding place. The food represented more than practical assistance. It was a gesture of recognition, soldier to soldier, acknowledging their shared humanity despite the circumstances that had made them enemies. Müller would later describe this decision as the most important choice of his military service, more significant than any tactical victory or strategic objective he might have achieved. The act of leaving food for an enemy combatant violated every military protocol he had been taught, but it affirmed a moral principle that transcended military regulations. Williams remained hidden in the farmhouse for 3 more days, listening to the sounds of combat moving westward as American reinforcements arrived to blunt the German offensive. When he finally emerged, Williams discovered Müller's gift and understood immediately what had occurred. An enemy soldier had chosen compassion over duty, mercy over military protocol, human connection over institutional loyalty. The simple act of leaving food had communicated more about the possibility for understanding between enemies than any propaganda or diplomatic initiative could have achieved. The Battle of the Bulge, as historians would later name this German offensive, continued for 6 more weeks. The operation ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives, but at enormous cost to both sides. American casualties totaled approximately 89,000 personnel who were either wounded, captured, or went missing, while German losses exceeded 100,000. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division, Müller's unit, suffered 60% casualties before the offensive concluded, reflecting the devastating impact of sustained combat operations during one of the war's most brutal winter campaigns. Williams successfully made his way back to American lines, where he was debriefed by intelligence officers who showed little interest in his account of the musical exchange with German soldiers. The story seemed too improbable for official reports, relegated to the category of wartime anecdotes that soldiers sometimes invented to cope with trauma or to make sense of experiences that defied conventional understanding of military operations. Williams was reassigned to a supply depot in France, where he spent the remainder of the European campaign supporting logistics operations. The dismissal of Williams' account by military intelligence reflected broader institutional patterns that prioritized tactical information over human stories. Official military culture had little framework for understanding moments of connection between enemies, viewing such incidents as irrelevant to the serious business of winning wars through superior strategy and firepower. However, for the individuals involved, these moments often proved to be the most meaningful experiences of their military service, shaping their understanding of human nature and their post-war attitudes toward former enemies. Müller survived the Battle of the Bulge, but was captured during the subsequent American counteroffensive in January 1945. He spent the remainder of the conflict in a prisoner of war camp in France, where he was surprised to discover that American guards treated German prisoners according to international legal standards. The humane treatment he received as a captive reinforced the lesson he had learned in the farmhouse, that individual choices matter more than institutional policies in determining human relationships. The prisoner of war camp experience provided Müller with additional evidence that the propaganda he had been exposed to during his military service had systematically distorted the character of American forces. Rather than the brutal, dehumanized enemies described in German military publications, he encountered guards who were often young men, not significantly different from himself, homesick, war-weary, eager for the conflict to end, so they could return to civilian pursuits. Many of these guards were willing to engage in conversation with German prisoners, sharing stories about their families and their hopes for the post-war period. After the war ended in May 1945, both Williams and Müller returned to civilian life, carrying with them the memory of their extraordinary encounter. Williams completed his education on the GI Bill, becoming a teacher in the Mississippi public school system, where he spent 35 years educating children about the importance of music, faith, and cross-cultural understanding. He often told his students about the power of song to build bridges between different communities, using his wartime experience as an example of how human connection could transcend artificial divisions created by politics and conflict. Williams' teaching career coincided with the American Civil Rights Movement, and his classroom became a space where students of different racial backgrounds could encounter each other as individuals rather than as representatives of opposing groups. His emphasis on the universal language of music provided a foundation for building understanding between communities that had been separated by decades of institutional segregation and mutual suspicion. Many of his former students later credited Williams with helping them develop the empathy and communication skills that made their own contributions to civil rights activism possible. Müller returned to his family's farm in Bavaria, where he spent the rest of his life as an agricultural worker and part-time musician. He joined the local church choir, where his experiences during the war had deepened his appreciation for the spiritual power of communal singing. Muller never spoke publicly about his wartime service, but he privately credited the encounter with the American soldier for preserving his faith in human goodness, despite the terrible things he had witnessed during years of combat on multiple fronts. Muller's post-war activities included organizing cultural exchanges between German and American communities, hosting visiting American students and veterans who came to Bavaria as part of reconciliation programs developed during the 1950s and 60s. He never revealed the specific incident that had motivated his commitment to international understanding, but his efforts contributed to the broader process of healing between former enemies that characterized post-war European development. The two men never met again, but their brief intersection had lasting effects that extended far beyond their individual lives. Williams' teaching career influenced hundreds of students who went on to become teachers, musicians, civil rights activists, and community leaders throughout the American South. His emphasis on the universal language of music contributed to breaking down racial barriers in his community during the civil rights movement, providing tools and concepts that helped bridge divides between different ethnic and cultural groups. Muller's involvement in reconciliation programs touched the lives of countless young Americans who visited Germany as part of educational exchanges, military deployments, or cultural initiatives. His quiet example of hospitality and friendship helped reshape American attitudes toward Germany and Germans, contributing to the development of strong transatlantic relationships that would prove crucial during the Cold War period and beyond. The farmhouse where their encounter occurred was destroyed during subsequent fighting in January 1945. However, the location was later marked by a small memorial erected by Belgian villagers who had heard rumors of the extraordinary Christmas truce that had taken place there. The memorial inscription, written in French, English, and German, reads, "In memory of all who found humanity in the midst of inhumanity, Christmas 1944. The memorial became a site of pilgrimage for veterans from multiple nations, family members seeking to understand their relatives' wartime experiences, and historians studying the human dimensions of 20th century conflict. Annual ceremonies held at the site brought together representatives of former enemy nations, creating opportunities for continued dialogue about the lessons of warfare and the possibilities for international cooperation and understanding. Historical research conducted decades later confirmed many details of Williams' and Muller's accounts, including unit positions, German offensive operations, and the broader context of the Battle of the Bulge. The documentation validated their experiences while highlighting the significance of individual choices during wartime. Military historians began to recognize that such personal encounters, while rarely documented in official records, played crucial roles in shaping soldiers' understanding of their enemies and themselves. The validation of their accounts contributed to broader scholarly recognition that warfare consists not only of strategic movements and tactical engagements, but also of countless personal interactions that shape the human experience of conflict and its aftermath. These individual encounters often proved more influential than official propaganda or institutional policies in determining post-war attitudes and relationships between former enemies. The story gained wider attention in the 1980s when Williams' grandson, a journalism student, interviewed his grandfather about his wartime experiences and published the account in a regional newspaper. The article sparked interest from historians studying personal narratives of World War II, leading to broader research into similar incidents of spontaneous truces and cross-enemy contact during the conflict. Documentary evidence revealed that such encounters, while rare, occurred with sufficient frequency to constitute a recognizable pattern of human behavior during wartime. Soldiers on all sides occasionally chose compassion over combat, recognition over revenge, mercy over military duty. These choices, individually small, collectively contributed to the preservation of moral standards during humanity's most destructive conflict. The musical exchange between Williams and Muller represented something larger than a single incident. It demonstrated the persistent power of artistic expression to transcend political and cultural boundaries. Music, with its ability to communicate emotion directly, without requiring translation or interpretation, served as a universal language that could bridge even the most fundamental divisions between human beings. Modern psychological research has validated the neurological basis for music's cross-cultural appeal. Human brains are hardwired to respond to musical patterns, rhythm, and melody in ways that bypass rational thought and speak directly to emotional centers. This scientific understanding helps explain why Williams' hymns and Muller's carols could create instant connection between soldiers who could not understand each other's spoken languages. The incident also illustrated the complex moral landscape that individual soldiers navigated during wartime. While institutional pressures promoted dehumanization of enemies, personal encounters often revealed the fundamental similarities between combatants. Soldiers on all sides struggled with homesickness, fear, uncertainty about the future, and longing for connection with family and community. These shared experiences created potential for understanding that transcended national and ideological boundaries. The choice made by Muller to respond to enemy singing with his own musical offering rather than with violence demonstrated the possibility for individual moral agency, even within the most constrained circumstances. His decision carried significant personal risk, potentially exposing him to charges of failing in his military duties. However, Muller's recognition of shared humanity proved more powerful than institutional expectations or military protocol. Williams's decision to sing, initially unconscious and driven by emotional need, became a conscious choice to continue when he heard German voices above. Rather than falling silent to maintain concealment, he chose to maintain his musical expression despite the obvious risks. His courage was not the traditional battlefield bravery celebrated in military traditions, but rather the courage to remain vulnerable and human in circumstances that demanded hardness and violence. The lasting impact of their encounter extended through multiple generations, influencing the post-war careers and attitudes of both men and the communities they served. Williams's teaching emphasized the importance of cultural understanding and the power of artistic expression to build bridges between different groups. Muller's involvement in reconciliation programs contributed to the broader process of rebuilding relationships between German and American societies. Their story became part of a larger narrative about the power of individual choices to create positive change, even in the most difficult circumstances. Military historians increasingly recognized that warfare consists not only of strategic movements and tactical engagements, but also of countless personal interactions that shape the human experience of conflict and its aftermath. The preservation of this story, through family memory and eventually historical documentation, demonstrates the importance of personal narratives in understanding the complete picture of historical events. Official military records captured the strategic and tactical dimensions of the Battle of the Bulge, but they could not document the human moments of connection that occurred between enemies during the fighting. The incident stands as a testament to the possibility for human connection to transcend even the most fundamental divisions created by war, ideology, and cultural difference. In a moment when institutional pressures demanded violence and hatred, individual human beings chose music and mercy instead. Their choice reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, people retain the capacity to recognize their shared humanity and to act on that recognition despite significant personal risk. In the years following the war, both Williams and Muller became inadvertent ambassadors for the power of human connection to overcome artificial divisions. Williams' teaching methods incorporated music from multiple cultures, exposing his students to German folk songs, French carols, and spiritual traditions from around the world. He believed that understanding different musical traditions helped young people develop empathy for cultures they might otherwise view as foreign or threatening. Williams's classroom became famous throughout his school district for its innovative approach to multicultural education. He would begin each school year by teaching his students songs from different countries, explaining the historical and cultural contexts that had shaped these musical expressions. By the end of the year, students who had entered his classroom with limited awareness of the wider world would be singing songs in multiple languages and discussing the common themes of hope, love, and struggle that appeared in musical traditions across all cultures. One of Williams' most effective teaching techniques involved having students research the historical backgrounds of different songs, encouraging them to understand how music had served various functions in different societies, as entertainment, as religious expression, as political resistance, as cultural preservation, and as communication between groups who spoke different languages. These research projects helped students develop critical thinking skills while building appreciation for cultural diversity. Müller's post-war activities were more private but equally significant in their impact on German-American relations. His farm became an informal meeting place for American military personnel stationed in Germany during the occupation period and the early years of the Cold War. Müller would invite visiting Americans to join his family for meals, sharing traditional Bavarian cuisine and introducing them to local customs and traditions that helped humanize German culture for soldiers who had been trained to view Germany primarily through the lens of recent conflict. These informal cultural exchanges proved remarkably effective in building positive relationships between former enemies. American soldiers who had expected to encounter a hostile population instead found themselves welcomed into German homes, where they could experience the warmth of family life and the richness of local traditions. Many of these soldiers returned to the United States with fundamentally changed attitudes toward Germany and Germans, becoming advocates for continued cooperation and friendship between the two nations. Müller also participated in agricultural exchange programs that brought American farmers to Bavaria to study European farming techniques, while sending German farmers to visit American agricultural operations. These exchanges focused on technical cooperation rather than political reconciliation, but they created numerous opportunities for personal connections that transcended national boundaries. Farmers from both countries discovered that they shared similar challenges and concerns regardless of their national origins. The impact of Williams and Müller's approaches to reconciliation extended far beyond their immediate communities. Williams' former students became teachers themselves, carrying his methods and philosophy into classrooms throughout the American South. His emphasis on music as a universal language proved particularly valuable during the civil rights movement, when communities were struggling to overcome decades of racial segregation and mistrust. Several of Williams' former students became prominent civil rights activists, crediting their teacher with helping them understand that meaningful social change required building bridges between different groups rather than simply defeating opponents. The musical skills and cultural knowledge they had acquired in Williams' classroom provided tools for creating common ground with people who might otherwise have remained adversaries. Müller's influence on German-American relations was recognized when he was invited to participate in official reconciliation ceremonies during the 1960s and 70s. These events brought together veterans from both sides of the conflict to commemorate shared losses and celebrate the friendship that had developed between former enemies. Müller's quiet dignity and obvious sincerity made him an effective representative of the possibility for healing and understanding even after the most bitter conflicts. The farmhouse incident also contributed to broader scholarly understanding of how individual choices during wartime could influence post-war relationships between nations. Historians studying the development of transatlantic cooperation during the Cold War period identified numerous examples of personal connections formed during World War II that later facilitated diplomatic and cultural cooperation between the United States and West Germany. Research revealed that American veterans who had positive personal encounters with German prisoners of war or civilian populations were significantly more likely to support policies of reconciliation and cooperation in the post-war period. Similarly, German veterans who had been treated humanely by American forces were more likely to support pro-Western political parties and policies during the rebuilding of German democratic institutions. The musical exchange between Williams and Müller became part of a larger pattern of cultural diplomacy that helped rebuild relationships between former enemies. Music, sports, educational exchanges, and artistic collaborations provided non-political venues where people from different nations could encounter each other as individuals rather than as representatives of opposing governments or ideologies. During the 1950s and 60s, numerous formal programs were established to promote cultural understanding, between the United States and West Germany. These included student exchange programs, sister city relationships, artistic collaborations, and academic conferences that brought together scholars, artists, and community leaders from both countries. Many participants in these programs credited personal stories like Williams and Muller's encounter for inspiring their involvement in reconciliation efforts. The story also influenced military training programs in both countries. American military academies began incorporating case studies of positive encounters between enemies as examples of how individual choices could have strategic consequences. The recognition that treating enemies humanely could facilitate post-war cooperation became part of official military doctrine regarding the conduct of military operations and the treatment of prisoners and civilian populations. German military training similarly emphasized the importance of maintaining moral standards even during combat operations. The example of soldiers like Muller, who had chosen mercy over military protocol, became part of educational programs designed to help military personnel navigate complex moral situations where institutional demands might conflict with ethical principles. The farmhouse incident was eventually documented in multiple academic studies, examining the role of personal narratives in shaping historical memory and post-war relationships. Scholars from universities in both countries collaborated on research projects that collected and analyzed hundreds of similar stories, creating a comprehensive database of cross-enemy encounters during World War II. This research revealed that such encounters were far more common than official military records had suggested. Soldiers on all sides regularly faced situations where they could choose between strict adherence to military protocol and recognition of enemy humanity. The cumulative effect of thousands of individual choices to show mercy, compassion, or simple recognition of shared humanity had significant influence on post-war attitudes and relationships. The documentation of these stories also contributed to changing public understanding of warfare itself. Rather than viewing war as simply a contest between opposing military forces, scholars and the general public began to recognize that warfare consists of countless personal interactions that shape both the immediate experience of conflict and its long-term consequences for the societies involved. Williams and Mueller both lived to see the reunification of Germany in 1990, an event that seemed to vindicate their belief in the power of human connection to overcome political divisions. Williams, by then retired from teaching, watched the television coverage of the Berlin Wall's collapse and reportedly told his family that the moment reminded him of the power of music to bring down barriers between people. Mueller, despite his advanced age, traveled to Berlin to witness the reunification celebrations personally. He later described the experience as the fulfillment of hopes he had carried since that Christmas Eve encounter in the Belgian farmhouse. The sight of former enemies celebrating together seemed to confirm that the choice he had made to respond to enemy singing with his own music had been part of a larger process of healing that had taken decades to complete. The legacy of their encounter continues to influence contemporary discussions about conflict resolution and international relations. Diplomats, peace negotiators, and conflict resolution specialists study cases like theirs to understand how personal connections can create possibilities for resolving even the most seemingly intractable disputes between nations and communities. Educational programs in multiple countries now use the Williams-Muller story as an example of how individual moral courage can have consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. Students learn that their own choices about how to treat people who are different from themselves can contribute to either perpetuating divisions or building bridges toward understanding and cooperation. The story has also inspired artistic works, including songs, plays, and documentary films that explore themes of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the power of music to transcend cultural boundaries. These artistic interpretations have helped bring the story to wider audiences while preserving its essential message about the possibility for human connection even in the most difficult circumstances. Modern conflict resolution experts point to the farmhouse incident as an example of how spontaneous acts of recognition and respect can create openings for broader reconciliation processes. They note that the musical exchange created a space outside normal military categories, where human beings could encounter each other as individuals rather than as representatives of opposing forces. The incident demonstrates that even in highly structured and institutionalized conflicts like modern warfare, individuals retain the capacity for moral agency and the ability to choose cooperation over competition, recognition over dehumanization, mercy over violence. These choices, while they may seem small in the context of larger military operations, can have profound consequences for the individuals involved and for the broader relationships between the communities they represent. Contemporary peace education programs incorporate the Williams-Muller story into curricula designed to help students understand how they can contribute to building more peaceful and cooperative relationships in their own communities and between different nations. The story provides a concrete example of how ordinary people can make extraordinary choices that help create possibilities for healing and understanding even after the most bitter conflicts. The enduring power of their story lies in its demonstration that human beings possess an inherent capacity for recognizing their shared humanity, even when institutional pressures and political circumstances seem to demand otherwise. In choosing to respond to enemy singing with their own musical offering, Williams and Muller affirmed values that transcend nationality, ideology, and the artificial divisions created by warfare. Their choice reminds us that music, faith, and the fundamental human need for connection are more powerful than the forces that seek to divide us. Even in the darkest moments of human history, individuals can choose to affirm life over destruction, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair. These choices, accumulated across millions of individual encounters, ultimately determine whether conflicts lead to lasting cycles of revenge and violence or to opportunities for reconciliation and peace. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.